give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where never is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not clouded all day. These words, penned by a doctor in Smith County, Kansas in the early 1870s, would not only be set to music, recorded by major musical artists of the 20th century, and eventually be named the state song of Kansas, but would also become one of the most recorded and beloved of cowboy folk tunes in our history.
Home on the Range is our state song of Kansas, and happens to be the only state song in America that was also called a cowboy song. And the reason that was a cowboy song, this Home on the Range started out as a poem back in the 1870s in Smith County in north central Kansas by a doctor by the name of Brewster Higley.
He wrote a poem, My Western Home. True Breeze from Smith Center brought someone in to be treated who had shot himself in the foot.
This guy brought a man in for him to treat. While the doctor was treating him, he started reading a book, and the doctor had stuck this poem, folded up, stuck it in there, and it fell out. And this guy picked it up and looked at it and says, "You got to get this published, get this in a newspaper." And Dan Kelly, who's from back east, Rhode Island or somewhere, had come out to Kansas. He had relatives here, and he was a guitar player, and he picked out a tune.
So he set it to music. Then there was the Harlan Brothers Band in Harlan who sang it, and the head of the Harlan Brothers Band said it needed a refrain. And that's when My Western Home became the song.
And they start playing this at barn dances and other dances at this little band up there, family band. Now, Smith County is not that far from the Great Western Trail, and cowboys going through their drovers would go to those dances. Of course, a lot of them never missed a chance to go to a dance. And they heard the song, and it entered folk tradition.
But being a cowboy song, which was sung along the trails up and down all the time, it had many varieties to it because they didn't have a song book and probably have the poem. They knew something about it, so many versions of it were around.
They started singing it, many different versions. There was one entitled My Colorado Home, one My Arizona Home, I think. But they carried this song all over the West, the way folk songs travel. Folk songs, someone makes one up, and they have to have an author. Someone has to be the one to put the words, the melody to it, but after that they go in the folk tradition and no one knows who wrote them or whatever.
There have been different versions of it. When it was originally written, the title was Western Home. The Brewster Higley titled it Western Home. It's a song that you can fairly easily add another verse to it, and that's been done a few times. A musical bridge was added at one time as well. So I'm going to be singing it as more like my Western Home. So here we go. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where never is heard a discouraging word, and the sky is not clouded all day. a home, where the deer and the antelope play, where never is heard a discouraging word, and the sky is not clouded all day. Oh, give me the gale of the Solomon Vale, where light streams with buoyancy flow. On the banks of the Beaver, where seldom, if ever, any poisonous herbage does grow. A home, where the deer and the antelope play, where never is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not clouded all day. I think it achieved, you might say, national appeal in about the early 1930s. 1933, Bing Crosby recorded it.
Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was he asked it to be played on the steps of the White House.
And that really made it popular. And of course, it had been over, Vernon Dalhart had recorded it in 1926, I think. Very well-known and very excellent country singer, one of the pioneers of country music.
And the skies are not cloudy all day, where the air is
The couple name was William and Mary Goodwin from Tempe, Arizona. They copyrighted that song in the early 1900s, copyrighted the words.
It was My Arizona Home, and so they sued NBC to quit playing the song.
Well, instead of paying, the whatever organization it was hires Samuel Monfeld to go out to disprove their claim. That's what they wanted him to do. Well, he goes west. He goes to like 7 states, I think, before he finally hits Kansas.
And then he ran the story to prove it and traced it back here. True Reese was the one that really was the one that was alive yet that knew Higley. Yeah. And so that's how it proved then to be written here in Smith County.
And the poem was published in some of the local papers, wasn't it?
Yes, and the interesting thing is that it was originally published in the Smith County Pioneer. But when it came to time to do the litigation and they wanted proof that it had been printed, because this is where the history gets befuddled. It was actually written in 71. But that record was destroyed in a fire at the Pioneer of the paper in Smith Center. So they had to use the Kerwin Chief story.
And I wish I knew, I don't, but I wish I knew if this couple that copyrighted it had even been born in 1872 when he wrote it. But at any rate, they immediately dropped their lawsuits. They were disproven. This guy had positive proof that the song had been written in the early 1870s.
And if you want to know the whole story, we have a movie that tells this story of how it was written and then how it was proven to be his song.
I'm Ken Spurgeon, and I'm a professor here at Friends University. I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to make films over the past 20 years or so, primarily documentaries and docudramas. And how I got to the Home on the Range project is an interesting story. We had just finished a film called The Road to Valhalla, which was up for some awards, primarily at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. And ElDean Holthus was at one of my talks, and he came up to me afterwards and said, "I have a story for you." What it became was not exactly what I thought it was at the outset. At the outset, I thought Home on the Range, the story of the song. So I realized in researching the story that there was a greater hook than maybe the one I originally thought was there, which was the lawsuit. And to me, the lawsuit was a vehicle. It was a true story, of course, but it was also a vehicle to discuss Home on the Range's history in the 1870s, Home on the Range's history in the early 20th century with different artists recording it, and then Home on the Range's story in the 1930s when it became the song, the most popular song in America. And even as we did the project, realizing how many artists knew it, how many musicians knew it, how you could play it in China and people knew that one song, or in South America, that blew my mind. I don't know that anyone can explain why Home on the Range became so big and so spread out. Like, why did it have the legs it had? It was somehow memorable. It was memorable just even in the tune standpoint. Of course, we as Kansans, we think about the lyrics. But one of the things we learned was there was lots of lyrics as that song traveled first up and down the trail.
Folk music itself, folk songs, they show up all over the place. They just, there was no radio back then, no television. Entertainment was homemade, and dances, barn dances and other dances were very popular. And so a lot of the songs they were playing at these dances were folk music. So that's one reason it travels around a lot. But I think one thing that really attracted people to it was it's just, home on the range where the deer and the antelope play is just this image of the West. And of course, the American West has caught the imagination, still has it, of the country.
When the film came out, I remember being at a premiere in Kansas City. We sold out at Union Station. And I remember after the show, several people coming up to me and saying, I heard it for the first time when? And I realized that has become a thing. And two of those stories that night, one was a guy came up to me and he said the first time I heard this was at a soccer field when I was a child in like Scotland. And he said they were singing it back and forth across the pitch. Another person came up to me and told me that they'd heard it for the first time in the closed Soviet Union in the 70s. And again, the breadth of that song just blows you away.
Admiral Byrd, he's down in the Antarctic for months alone, and he would fight homesickness and boredom, he said, by singing Home on the Range over and over. William Allen White, famous newspaper editor from Emporia, his son, William Lindsay White, was also a newspaperman. He's in Europe about the time of World War II, just after or something, and he said they're singing that song all over Budapest.
I went to Germany in 2017 and wore logos with Home of the Range. They didn't know anything about the cabin, but they all knew the song. There's a tribe in the Philippines that in their own language had Home on the Range.
One of my co-writers, Orrin Friesen, who's kind of a famous DJ and musician down near Wichita, Orrin immediately said, well, we could have these people record, or these folks record, or this artist record Home on the Range, or songs related to that period. And I said, sure. And it went from discussing who might be able to how many wanted to. And that also kind of blew me away, because lots of artists wanted to record. Michael Martin Murphey, who's a friend of ours, he wanted to record, and of course we wanted him to. But the one that surprised me was Kansas, the rock band Kansas. We contacted them and they immediately were interested. I went to a concert before we talked to them, before we actually connected. And at the end of the Kansas concert, their walkout music is Home on the Range, had been Home on the Range. And then I was like, we've got to talk to them. And of course we did, and they were just very, very kind, and we ended up recording them in Lawrence. They later put Home on the Range on their next album, which is also cool.
And the skies are not cloudy all day.
I was born in 1932, and my Uncle Pete and Aunt Ellen Rust bought the property in 1935. And it was always known that this cabin was built by Dr. Brewster Higley. But nothing was ever done with it. In fact, it was a chicken house. When I grew up as a small boy, they were using it as a chicken house. if we fast forward to 1947, the Kansas legislature declared it to be the state song of Kansas. That perked up some interest in it. North of here, about 50 miles, is Minden, Nebraska, with what's called Pioneer Village. And Harold Warp owned the Pioneer Village. Well, right after the legislature made Home of the Range the state song, he came down and he said, I want to buy the cabin, and signed a blank check and pushed it over in front of Uncle Pete and Aunt Ellen. In my mind, I believe that Uncle Pete looked at Aunt Ellen and just pushed the check back. That set the tone that this cabin was always going to remain here, because they had multiple opportunities of people that wanted to buy it. Because when Uncle Pete said, what are you going to do with it? He said, I'm going to move it to Minden. And so I always ask visitors like you, if my aunt and uncle hadn't saved this, you'd come by here and you'd see a sign and say, this is where the cabin used to be. Which would you rather see, the cabin or a sign? He would, sure.
You know, there's no doubt between the 1930s and maybe the last 20 years, the reason that the Home on the Range cabin, the foundation, and all that has stayed alive is the love of ElDean Holthus and his family. I mean, they've almost single-handedly held up the torch of the Home on the Range site.
My name is Mark McLean. I'm trust officer here at the People's Bank. One of my responsibilities, I'm a board member and the president of the People's Heartland Foundation. And our first account, so to speak, was the cabin site of Home on the Range. You know, I think ElDean's family deserves so much credit. One, the fact that we still have the cabin. The family always felt that it was important that it be where it is, for people to be able to come and just enjoy it.
After ElDean first spoke with me about wanting to do something film-wise about Home on the Range, it did take me a few minutes to realize that ElDean's son was Mitch Holthus, the voice of the Kansas City Chiefs. And I already was thinking almost immediately about a radio station being the centerpiece of this story, because it was. So who was better to be, a DJ or a host in a radio station than Mitch Holthus? And of course, Mitch graciously agreed and was wonderful. And of course, he carries on the tradition very much so.
In carrying on family tradition, Mitch Holthus sponsors fundraising events to support the ongoing development of the Home on the Range site.
And that's Mitch's spring celebration. He gets several players, chief players, to come every year. It's pretty cool. And what's really been neat is some of the players keep coming back. We're privileged to be the carekeepers now of the cabin, and how important that is, so that it will go for generations forward.
And thanks to Uncle Pete and Aunt Ellen, People's Heartland Foundation, local community and all that, it's going to stay here forever. I mean, this is going to be something you can come back and visit every couple of years. There's always going to be something new here. We're going to have the cowboy era, which is Higley, the cabin, and then we have 11 acres that's going to be devoted to Native Americans, probably with emphasis on the Pawnee, because they were in this area.
And the amphitheater.
Yes, all right, and that right now, we have an artist rendition, and that's our next major project. And the amphitheater, then that'll open up all kinds of things for us here, and it helps promote our rural area.
You know, everything that ElDean and the People's Heartland Foundation have done for preserving a Home on the Range cabin, they did it when there was no support. They did it when there was no state or government entity. You know, the bottom line is people have to care. It's going to be up to the rest of us now to keep these historic sites, Home on the Range and others, still around and still taken care of and still preserved. It was neat in the process of doing our film for some of these artists. They wanted to go see it. They wanted to go see it. They wanted to stand in the same structure that this song was written. I mean, how many times can you go back to the real origins and say, I'm really here. I'm in that space.
The cabin was built in 1872, and so it's 150 years old, and you're going to do something unique here that very few people have had the opportunity to do. You're going to sing a song that is 150 years old on the site where it was written, in or by the cabin built by the author. You're a little bit of history today. You're making your own little bit part of Kansas history today.
The thing about Home on the Range too is it's a simple song. It has a simple chorus and it has a good melody to it. And so many people have seen it in the movies all over the world, and especially in the United States, that it is a very familiar song with everybody. And it's been around since the 1870s, at least, with the cowboys and the trail drivers. So there was a lot of spread of Home on the Range. I'm sure it was probably not only sang around campfires in the cowboy days, but probably in saloons and opera houses and everything else throughout the state of Kansas and throughout the plains and throughout the nation.
Kansas picked it as our state song I think in June of 1947.
It's one reason it's so important to us is that it is our song. And when the legislature in 1947 made it a state song, and an act they have never surpassed, maybe equaled it, it really is ours. Why is it the world's? That is interesting. Why was it being sung in Russia in the 1960s or 70s, in Moscow, streets of Moscow? Why did William Lindsay White hear it in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and places like that?
There is something about it that, it's always come up in the legislature. Oh, we need to change the song. There's nothing about Kansas in it, and so forth. But who is Kansas?
Right.
I was asked, that was my very first interview that I ever did, was German Public Radio. And he said, why do you think it's so important or so popular around the world? I've never been asked that. And so you can probably guess I got an answer for everybody. So I thought for a little bit and I said, well, sir, I tell you this. I don't care where you're born or where you live or where your home was. But close your eyes and sing, "Oh, Give Me a Home." And I challenge you not to think about your home.